Okay, here's a thought to kick us off. What if your team's biggest threat isn't, the usual dysfunction we talk about, but actually it's comfort? What if the real danger isn't the conflict we try to manage, maybe a cohesion that's just settled, become complacent? We're talking about moving past just doing good work, which is important, of course, but seeing that as maybe the starting point for becoming a catalyst for something, well, much bigger. Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you give us and really try to unearth the most compelling insights. Today, we're diving into a really powerful idea, moving beyond simply functioning as a team to truly performing with focus and becoming what one of our sources calls a missional engine. That's a striking phrase. And look, this isn't just about productivity for productivity's sake. It's presented as really profound shift in how we understand success and impact, especially within a spiritual framework.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, how the source really pushes back on our everyday ideas of performance.
hmm
It invites us, doesn't it, to redefine it, to see it through this lens of spiritual fruitfulness, divine intentionality. So our mission today really is to unpack how a team can go beyond just, well, team life, which can sometimes get a bit inward-looking and become this outward-bearing catalyst, aligning with a purpose that's deeper, more impactful. And we'll definitely explore that paradox you mentioned, how the very health a team works so hard for can kind of surprisingly become the barrier to breakthrough if it's not, reframed correctly.
Okay, let's unpack that paradox then.
Yeah.
Because the source puts it quite bluntly. It says, the very health a team achieves may be the barrier to breakthrough.
Okay.
Why? Well, because, and I'm quoting here, healthy isn't the same as fruitful, and functioning isn't the same as performing, at least not in the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests teams can hit this plateau, a comfortable maturity, and they mistake that harmony for actual momentum. They end up becoming like containers holding onto something rather than conduits letting it flow through them.
Mm-hmm. And that raises a really critical question, I think, for anyone leading or part of a team today. In this world that's changing so fast, the teams that really thrive, they're not just the ones who get along well or, run efficiently. They're the ones that manage to move beyond that internal cohesion to making an external difference, an outward consequence. They're aligning with something bigger. And the danger the source flags is that inertia is no longer an option, sticking with the status quo. Teams clinging to just control or maintenance, they actually risk becoming irrelevant. It's a real call to proactive movement, not just staying comfortable.
So how does this play out then, this sort of radical rethinking of performance?
Yeah.
Well, the source challenges us to see it not as, say, hitting internal KPIs, the usual metrics, but as a living, breathing overflow of God's work through us. Imagine measuring success differently, not by, meeting attendance or program stats, but by the external impact, our lives being transformed, our new disciple makers emerging, our communities genuinely changing. It's described as a total paradigm shift, moving from sacred time around the table into sacred momentum out on the streets.
Yeah, and when you connect that to the bigger picture, it becomes really clear this isn't just like tweaking your strategy a bit. It's fundamental. It changes how success itself is perceived, right at the core. The source poses this question: what if your next team meeting measured obedience to God's leading more than task completion? Wow. That's a profound shift, isn't it? It moves us from what's often a very results-driven culture to what the source calls a revelation-driven one, which implies, well, a much deeper level of listening and responding.
Okay, now here's where it goes even deeper, I think. Our sources really emphasize that performance, in this specific context, takes on an eternal dimension. It's not primarily about our effort, our human striving. It's about aligning with a spiritual reality. And the blueprint of fruitfulness, as they call it, comes straight from Jesus' metaphor in John 15. The vine and the branches. He says, abide in me and I in you. The branch can't bear fruit by itself, right? Unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. So fruitfulness, in this view, is really a byproduct. It comes from surrender, from that deep spiritual connection first, then action.
Exactly. And what's so illuminating there is the idea that performing is not about doing more. It is about becoming more aligned. It's about the birth of spirit-led synergy. That's the phrase used. A kind of unity that actually advances the mission efficiently. And the early church in Acts 2 is held up as this really compelling case study, remember, devoted to fellowship, teaching, filled with awe, unified in spirit, and deeply focused on the mission. Their impact was described as organic, catalytic, and missional. Why? Because, the source argues, they were utterly spirit-led and fellowship-focused. Their shared life together actually fueled their outward movement.
So practically then, how do teams actually embody this kind of kingdom performance? Well, the sources highlight unity is power, not preference. which echoes Psalm 133, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The beautiful picture of unity bringing blessing. So this means cultivating a spirit-born harmony, one that doesn't just tolerate differences, but celebrates them, submits to one another, strategizes prayerfully. And then there's this idea of fellowship as formation, which is more than just your regular team meetings. It's presented as a crucible of character formation, marked by real accountability, mutual encouragement, and that corporate discernment we see in Hebrews 10.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Are our teams truly celebrating the different gifts and perspectives? Like 1 Corinthians 12 talks about every part of the body being vital. And are we genuinely submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, as Ephesians 5 puts it? Because this kind of synergy, it's not just about, everyone getting along nicely. It's described as sacred chemistry. It's about aligning hearts around a shared calling, not just finding comfort in being together. It's deeper, more intentional.
Yeah, and the sources go on to explain how this reframes success. It's not just about output or tasks checked off a list. It's measured by obedience and impact. So instead of a team asking, maybe at the end of a quarter, right, what did we accomplish? A Spirit-led team might ask, were we obedient? Did we do what the Spirit led us to do? And did this effort actually reflect the character of Christ? And crucially, whose lives were genuinely touched in this process? This naturally leads, they argue, to missional multiplication over maintenance.
Right. And if we zoom out again, that model from Jesus in Luke 10, sending out the 72, it provides such a clear picture of this. It's all about equipping others, releasing them often in pairs, interestingly, and really trusting the Spirit to provide. So true performance, in this sense, isn't about trying to do all the work ourselves, which is exhausting, frankly. It's about building capacity for others to carry the mission. That's a fundamental shift, moving from being the sole doers to becoming equippers, empowerers.
Yeah, and this deep dive really calls us to think about performance through what it terms an apostolic imagination. It's not about doing more for God, which, let's be honest, can often just lead to burnout, but it's about participating more fully with God. A subtle but huge difference. It's that shift from relying on solo ministry to unleashing a community that ministers together. And what's really fascinating, and something our sources really focus on, is that example of Paul in Ephesus. You find it in Acts 19. This single story, they point out, describes a result that is just, staggering. All the Jews in Greece who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord in just 2 years. And think of it, no modern technology, no mass media campaigns. How? It wasn't a hero model, one superstar leader carrying everything. It was what they call a kingdom ecosystem. Paul investing in, discipling just 12 believers initially, teaching daily in that rented hall, empowering them. And the gospel spread because, as the source puts it, disciples disciple, leaders multiply, and the Spirit moves through teams.
That Ephesus narrative really does highlight a key principle, doesn't it? That apostolic performance is not about personality-driven leadership, but about Spirit-filled leadership development. It's about that deep investment in a few, which then ripples out to impact many. And that theological blueprint from 1 Corinthians 12, the body of Christ, gift diverse, but unified in purpose, functioning through mutual dependence. It perfectly describes this kind of Spirit-designed organism. It's a powerful reminder that every single part has a role, and together they form something incredibly potent.
Okay, so what's the practical takeaway for us today? How do we apply this? Our sources distill some key principles from this apostolic model. Let me run through them quickly. First, abiding before advancing. That core truth from Jesus, apart from me, you can do nothing. Performance has to be Spirit-fed, not self-fueled. It starts with dependence.
Right.
Second, multiplication through mobilization. Just like Paul equipped others. You see it in 2 Timothy 2.2, delegating, leaving room for the Spirit to expand things. The goal isn't just programs, it's building disciple-making ecosystems that actually outlive the founder.
Sustainable impact.
Third, unity without uniformity. This kind of leadership isn't controlling. It honors gifts. It aligns people around the mission, not just personal preferences. And that diversity, it's actually a strength. Ensures coverage, flexibility, resilience.
That's key, avoiding the clone effect.
Exactly. And fourth, Spirit-led structures. This means building flexible frameworks, prioritizing discernment, being willing to yield to God's timing and prompting, like the early church did in Acts 13 and 15, waiting on the Spirit.
Yeah, and when you put all those principles together, they really challenge us, don't they? To move from, as the source says, building towers to bearing fruit, from performing for results to performing as worship. It really urges us to, well, decentralize power, to embed that spiritual DNA through actual training pipelines, not just osmosis, and to foster that global, local synergy, intentionally empowering local indigenous leaders. It's a much more organic, decentralized way of thinking about growth.
Okay, but let's be real. Even this kind of high performance, it has a potential downside, a shadow side. Our sources warn that success in the kingdom is a double-edged sword, and that maturity is vulnerable because of familiarity. Comfortable can become complacent. They actually list 4 core dangers that can trip up even the most well-intentioned teams. First, mission drift. Success comes and it can subtly broaden the focus. You start chasing opportunities, maybe serving metrics, rather than sticking to the original mandate. The source points to Israel wanting what other nations have back in 1 Samuel 8, losing that unique calling.
Happens easily.
Second, burnout. Obvious one, maybe. When the momentum just outpaces soul care. Leaders become like machines, Sabbath becomes optional, that inner life just starves. They mention Moses feeling completely overwhelmed in Numbers 11.
Seen that too many times.
Third, control creep. As things grow, they get more complex, right? And the instinct is often to protect it, to manage it tightly. And leaders can start to retract authority. The example given is the Galatian churches trying to sort of finish by following rules rather than relying on the Spirit's freedom.
Yeah, the instinct to control what feels like it's succeeding.
Exactly. And fourth, cultural erosion. If multiplication happens too fast or without enough intention, that core spiritual DNA, things like prayer, humility, worship, obedience, it can get diluted. You end up with form without the fire, like Jesus warning those churches in Revelation who had a reputation of being alive, but you are dead.
Wow, yeah, that idea of cultural erosion is particularly stark, isn't it? I'm actually curious, thinking about our listeners, which of those 4 pitfalls, mission drift, burnout, control creep, or that cultural erosion, do you think might be the most common challenge they face in their own teams or leadership today? What's your sense?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because often one just feels more present than others, depending on the season, right?
I suspect mission drift and burnout are almost constant companions, especially in ministry or nonprofit contexts driven by deep passion. Passionate people, they often take on way too much, which leads straight to burnout. It's almost predictable. And success, even though we strive for it, it naturally creates new opportunities, new doors open. And it's so easy for those to subtly pull us away from the original core mission. Before you know it, you're doing 10 things okay instead of one thing really well. The antidote the source keeps coming back to for all of these is holy vigilance. I like that phrase. And remembering that fruit can become a fog, obscuring our need for the vine. Success can make us forget our dependence. The source also points a finger at the idolization of team life. When keeping the team happy and harmonious becomes more important than actually fulfilling the mission. Healthy team culture, absolutely crucial. But it's meant to be a launch pad, right? Not the final destination.
Right. The launch pad, not the destination. That's good. So, given these dangers, what does this mean for building teams that are not just high-performing, but also sustainable? How do you avoid crashing and burning? Well, our sources offer 5 really practical rhythms to embed into team life. First, celebration rhythms. Making space regularly to tell the God at work stories, sharing breakthroughs, acts of obedience, maybe stories of healing or transformation. It's described as spiritual reinforcement. It combats burnout by reminding everyone why they're doing what they're doing and who the real source of power is.
Vital. Keeps the focus right.
Second, coaching models. Shifting leadership style. Leading more through questions, not just assigning tasks like Jesus did. Asking Peter, who do you say I am? In Luke 9. It changes the conversation from just, what are you doing, to what is the Spirit saying to you? Much more empowering.
Yes, fosters ownership.
Third, feedback culture. Building enough trust within the team so you can actually tell the truth in love, like Proverbs 27 says. This means normalizing feedback, both affirmation and constructive adjustment. Maybe using simple models like SBI, situation, behavior, impact, to make it less personal, more objective.
Hard to do, but essential for growth.
Fourth, obedience-based metrics. This goes back to what we were saying earlier, redefining success by what actually matters to God. Remember 1 Samuel 15. To obey is better than sacrifice. So it means tracking stories of obedience, noting those Spirit-led pivots, celebrating faithfulness, not just looking at conversion numbers or social media reach alone.
Shifts the whole scorecard.
Totally. And fifth, strategic retreats. Just like Jesus pulled away with his disciples, Mark 6 tells us, come away by yourselves and rest a while. These aren't just holidays. They're essential times for recalibration, for reconnecting with the Spirit, for reaffirming the vision, and really importantly, for resetting relational trust within the team.
Yeah, what's really powerful there is how these rhythms work together to prevent that mission drift and burnout we talked about. The source gives that Urdaneta, Philippines case study, which really brings it to life. Here was a team initially just in survival mode. They felt overprogrammed, underprayed, sound familiar, but they made a shift. They moved towards coaching leaders. They started tracking life change stories instead of just activity. They began forming simple house churches. And the result wasn't necessarily a bigger, more complex organization. It was actually smaller in structure, but wider in influence. And crucially, joy returned and new leaders started emerging organically. It just beautifully underlines that point. Real performance comes from rootedness, not relentlessness.
Rootedness, not relentlessness. I like that. So we've covered a lot of ground about the paradox, the blueprint, the apostolic model, the pitfalls, the rhythms. When we think about applying all this, our source introduces a really helpful tool. It's called the focus map. It's described as a diagnostic framework. It helps teams evaluate 6 key areas of gospel faithfulness. These are abiding in Christ, clarity of mission, gift utilization, reproducibility, joyful endurance, and finally, gospel impact indicators. And the idea isn't really to grade your team like giving it a score. It's more about guiding it, helping it see where it needs to perhaps deepen its alignment.
Right, and it makes you ask that crucial question. How do we make sure we're measuring the right things? The focus map deliberately culminates in these gospel impact indicators, which, again, aren't just dry statistics. They're meant to capture tangible evidence of spiritual transformation, measurable evidence of obedience and actual kingdom advance. These indicators are designed to resist what the source calls vanity metrics, the numbers that look good but don't necessarily reflect deep change. They prioritize obedience over optics and transformation over transaction. So, examples might include things like how many disciples are now actively discipling others? Are new communities of faith being birthed organically? Are individuals stepping up into leadership or recognizing their calling? Are there stories of costly obedience prompted by the Spirit? Is there actual local transformation happening, maybe around issues of justice or reconciliation? It's really about trying to measure what heaven celebrates.
Yeah, exactly. And these tools, the focus map, these indicators, they aren't just theory. They sound really practical. You could use them for regular team evaluations, couldn't you? Like maybe quarterly assessments where the team looks at the map together and decides on one bold action to take in each category for the next season. They seem invaluable for leadership development, too. Using the map categories for check-ins with emerging leaders, focusing on their spiritual formation, and even for organizational planning. Imagine starting your planning process with the focus map, getting clear on these core areas before you even dive into the budgets and financials.
Absolutely. And just to tie it back again to that real world scenario, that Urdaneta example is so compelling. Remember, that team initially scored pretty low on abiding and reproducibility, even though they had lots of activity, lots of momentum on the surface. But by using the focus map for monthly reflection, they were able to restructure, realign, and recenter. Prayer became foundational again, not an afterthought. Lay leaders started emerging naturally. New faith communities were birthed, not from a top-down strategy, but from prayerful obedience. And the result, the source sums it up. Less control, more fruit, fewer meetings, more movement. It's just such a powerful illustration of that shift, isn't it? From relying on human effort and structure to making space for spirit-led impact.
Fewer meetings, more movement? I think many teams would sign up for that. Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive today, we've really journeyed through this idea of performing with focus in a kingdom sense, moving beyond just comfort towards genuine fruitfulness, embracing that spirit-led synergy, learning from these powerful apostolic models like Paul in Ephesus. We've also faced, head-on, those critical pitfalls of high-performance burnout, drift, control, erosion, and we've discovered some really practical rhythms and tools, like that focus map, to help keep teams aligned, rooted, and sustainable. The source really leaves us with a challenge, doesn't it? It asks, are we content with maintaining, or are we hungry to multiply?
Yeah, I think this whole deep dive really brings home that true kingdom performance. It isn't about doing more faster. That's often our default mode, our cultural instinct. But it's actually about being deeply rooted and letting the Spirit do what only He can.
Yeah.
The invitation ultimately isn't to perform for God, like trying to impress Him with our activity, but to perform from God, to live and lead as these overflowing branches connected to the vine. And maybe that leaves us with one final provocative thought for you, our listener. What would genuinely shift in your team, in your leadership, in your organization, if you started celebrating obedience even more than you celebrate outcomes?
Obedience over outcomes.
Hmm.
That's definitely something to chew on. Well, that's our deep dive for today. We really hope you feel not just informed by these sources, but genuinely equipped, maybe even inspired to explore how your team can become that truly missional engine we talked about. We can't wait to see what you uncover.